Imagine standing in front of, like a massive collapsing skyscraper.
Oh, wow. Okay. Setting a scene right off the bat.
Yeah, I mean, the glass is shattering, the steel beams are groaning, and the whole concrete structure is cracking right down the middle.
Sounds terrifying.
It is, but, when a physical building falls apart, there is at least a certain mechanical clarity to it. Like, an engineer can walk up, point a flashlight at a rusted support strut and say, uh, there is the flaw. That is why the whole thing came down.
Right, because it is physical, it is visible, it is completely clean.
Yeah, we like failures to be tangible like that. Because tangibility means we can easily categorize the problem and, well, isolate it.
It gives us a sense of control, you know? Like, if we can see the rusted steel, we know we can replace the rusted steel. We know how to fix it.
Precisely.
Mm.
But then you step away from architecture and you look at the collapse of human morality.
Ooh, that is a hard pivot.
Right. You look at the spiritual decay of a society, or even just the slow, quiet fracturing of a single human soul, and suddenly that diagnostic scanner is completely useless.
The blueprints are just gone.
Gone. You are staring into this murky, terrifying landscape of human behavior, trying to figure out where the cracks even started.
Which is, I mean, the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. Trying to trace the origin point of human corruption is something philosophers and historians have lost sleep over for centuries.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We have a custom-tailored deep dive lined up for you today. We are pulling the core insights from an absolute heavyweight of a historical text, which is Matthew Poole's commentary on the first chapter of Romans.
That is quite the document.
It really is. So, okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at a text with staggering magnitude. I mean, this commentary outlines the absolute necessity of divine grace, and it sets that grace right against the stark, brutal backdrop of total human failure.
What's fascinating here is that this single chapter of an ancient letter contains both the highest theological peaks and the darkest psychological valleys of the ancient world.
Yeah, it covers so much ground.
It does. And our goal for you today is to analyze how this specific text completely dismantles human pride. We are going to look at the mechanics of imputed righteousness, and we are going to chart the terrifying descent of human rebellion.
Which is a brilliant, unsparing look at the human condition that feels, honestly, uncomfortably relevant right now.
Yeah, highly relevant.
So let's start at the very beginning of the letter with what I look at as a radical rebranding of the Apostle Paul.
Oh, I like that term, rebranding.
Yeah, because in verse 1, Paul opens by claiming the title, Servant of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to modern ears, a servant is a lowly position.
Right, it sounds like a demotion.
Exactly. But the commentary points out a massive irony in the historical context here. In the ancient world, emperors and great monarchs would actually style themselves as vassals to the gods.
Oh, right, because they wanted to be seen as the ultimate subjects to the divine.
Yeah. So by taking the title of servant to Christ, Paul is actually claiming a status higher than being the monarch of the entire world. He is bypassing Caesar entirely.
That is such a bold move, and the specific word used carries immense weight. I mean, Paul is not positioning himself as a casual volunteer or someone who just, agreed with a philosophy.
It wasn't a hobby for him.
No, not at all. He is identifying himself in direct relation to his singular, miraculous conversion. He was so obligated to Christ that he wholly devoted his entire existence to that specific duty.
But he does not stop as servant, does he?
No, he immediately moves to the astonishment of his vocation. He says he was called to be an apostle.
And Poole makes it very clear this was not some sort of promotion he earned.
Yeah.
Like, he didn't work his way up the corporate ladder of the early church.
No, he really didn't.
It was a sheer gift, which is shocking when you consider his resume.
Precisely. Poole references an old proverb from Israel. Is Saul also among the prophets? You see that in the Old Testament when King Saul, who was not exactly known for his piety, unexpectedly begins prophesying.
Right, and people were just stunned by that.
Yeah. And Poole applies that directly to Paul, whose Hebrew name was also Saul, of course. He says we might ask with great astonishment, is Saul also among the apostles?
Because his history was a literal nightmare for the people he's now leading. He was a violent, state-sponsored persecutor. He dragged families out of their homes.
It was the bad guy.
He was. Anyone who had seen him operating in Jerusalem would never have dreamed he would hold the highest office in the very movement he was trying to exterminate. It's a complete inversion of expectations.
And that background brings us to a highly specific detail regarding the word separated. He writes that he was separated unto the gospel of God.
Yeah, I was looking at that word. When I hear separated, my mind immediately goes to isolation. like a monk going off to live in a cave in the desert somewhere. Was Paul just saying he was retreating from society?
Not at all. It is actually a highly intentional play on words. It alludes directly to Paul's former life as a Pharisee.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, the very name Pharisee in Hebrew is derived from a root word meaning to separate.
Wow, okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so before his conversion, Paul was a Pharisee of the Pharisees, meaning he was entirely separated to the law. He lived his life setting himself apart from the general population based on strict, meticulous, legalistic adherence.
So he was the ultimate rule follower.
Right. But now, as a Christian, he is separated to the gospel of God.
So the intense dedication is still there, but the object of his devotion has shifted 180 degrees. He went from being obsessed with the law to being consumed by the good news.
That is a brilliant linguistic flip.
It really is.
Yeah.
But even with that background, he immediately has to deal with critics. People are always suspicious of new things, right? Paul anticipates objections from people claiming this whole Christian movement is just some sort of novelty.
We see that same suspicion today. If a religious movement is brand new, people assume it is a cult or a scam. But Paul cuts off that claim of novelty right in verse 2 by rooting his message firmly in the Old Testament prophets. He insists this is not a modern invention he just cooked up on the road to Damascus.
Right. He didn't just invent it out of thin air.
No. The history of the gospel was foreshadowed centuries prior. Jesus Christ, with all the benefits he brings, was promised by those whom God conversed with familiarly in the past. There is a total seamless harmony between the Old and New Testaments.
He's basically saying, I am not bringing you a new religion. I am bringing you the completion of the oldest promises we have.
Spot on.
And then he gets into the core of what that completion looks like in verses 3 and 4, dealing with the two natures of Christ. Let me try an analogy here.
Go for it.
Think about that massive skyscraper again. You have the visible structure, the glass, the steel, the lobby. That is the part you can walk up to and touch. But then you have the invisible foundation, the bedrock it sits on deep underground that actually holds the whole thing up.
Okay, follow you.
So the commentary describes Christ as made of the seed of David according to the flesh, which is that visible human lineage. You can trace his family tree, but then it contrasts that with declared to be the Son of God with divine potency according to the Spirit of holiness.
That analogy holds up really well. In regard to his human nature, his manhood, he was made. He was born into the lineage of the Virgin Mary, the seed of David. But in regard to his divine subsistence, he was eternal.
Right.
And Poole clarifies a crucial theological distinction here regarding his resurrection. The resurrection did not make him the Son of God.
Right, because if the resurrection made him divine, that would be adoptionism.
Yes, exactly.
The idea that he was just a spectacularly good, regular guy who earned divine status by passing a test.
Correct, which is a massive error the text strictly opposes. The resurrection miraculously demonstrated him to be the Son of God. It was the ultimate public vindication of his eternal identity.
So it was proof, not a promotion.
Yes. The divine nature, called here the Spirit of holiness, sanctified his natural body and showed the entire world his omnipotent majesty. He was already the Son of God. The resurrection was the indisputable proof.
Okay, so Paul establishes his own radical credentials. He roots his message in ancient prophecies to prove it is not a fad, and he centers everything on the dual nature of Christ.
That is a very solid opening argument.
It is. Now, let's look at who he is actually writing this letter to. He is addressing believers sitting right in the capital of the Roman Empire.
The absolute epicenter of the known world at that time.
And here is a historical nugget from the text that actually surprised me. You would assume a letter written to the Romans living in Rome would be written in Latin.
That would be the logical assumption, yeah.
But the commentary points out that it was originally written in Greek. Rome was a highly cosmopolitan city, a total melting pot. I love the quote the text brings in from the ancient Roman poet Juvenal. He complained and called Rome a Greek city because the inhabitants, native Romans and immigrants alike, widely used and understood Greek. It was a trade language.
It highlights how universally accessible Paul wanted this document to be. He was writing to all the faithful there, Jews and Gentiles, bond and free. Everyone could understand it.
That makes a lot of sense.
And addressing the believers in Rome brings up verse 8, where Paul says their faith is spoken of throughout the whole world.
Which leads to a massive historical and theological dispute.
It does indeed. Poole impartially reports a significant theological critique regarding this specific phrase. Proponents of the Roman Catholic view historically use this verse to claim that Rome is the mother church, the supreme authority over all other churches, simply because Paul says its faith was famous worldwide.
Right, they point to that fame as proof of hierarchy.
But Poole's text refutes this assertion by looking at the broader biblical context.
How does he walk through that argument?
Well, he points out that the church in Thessalonica received the exact same high praise from Paul in his letter to them. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians that their faith was also spoken of everywhere.
Oh, interesting. So it wasn't exclusive to Rome.
No, it wasn't. Therefore, geographical fame or widespread reputation does not equate to structural supremacy. Just because people are talking about your faith across the empire does not mean you hold jurisdictional authority over every other congregation.
That makes perfect logical sense. You can't claim exclusive supremacy based on a compliment that was literally also given to someone else.
Right, the logic just falls apart there.
But what really stands out to me in this section is Paul's attitude toward these Roman believers in verses 11 and 12. He talks about his deep desire to visit them. Now, you would expect a guy with his apostolic credentials writing to the capital city to take a top-down authoritarian approach.
You would think so. Like,
Yeah.
I am the apostle, I'm coming to audit your theology and fix your problems.
Exactly. But instead, he says he wants to be comforted by them. It is this beautiful concept of mutual faith. He's like a world-renowned, tenured professor hoping to sit down in a room full of freshman students and actually learn something from their perspective.
That mutual edification is a brilliant concept. Poole notes that the most ordinary of Christ's members can contribute to the edifying even of an apostle.
That is so humbling.
It is. The commentary references the Apostle John in his second epistle, where John expresses hope to be quickened and comforted by the graces of a woman and her children.
Wow.
Yeah, it shows that true spiritual comfort springs from the common faith they share, not from hierarchical status. Paul is not above receiving encouragement from the people he is meant to lead.
But he hasn't been able to visit them yet. He says he was let hitherto, which is an old way of saying hindered.
Right, blocked from going.
Yeah, he mentions hindrances by Satan, by the Spirit disposing of him to work elsewhere, or by his own physical infirmities, or even the urgent necessities of other churches. And then he says something striking in verse 14. He calls himself a debtor to both Greeks and barbarians. Now I hear debtor, and I instantly think of a financial loan. What does it mean that Paul considers himself in debt to people he has never even met?
He owes them the gospel.
He owes them.
Yeah, Poole explains this obligation very clearly. Preaching was not some arbitrary favor Paul was handing out from his own goodwill. It wasn't charity.
Okay.
It was a bound duty assigned to him by God. He was entrusted with massive spiritual talents, and he owed the return on those talents to the nations. He divides all nations into Greeks and barbarians, the educated and the uneducated, showing that this message is adapted to absolutely everyone. He feels a crushing weight of responsibility to, deliver the mail, so to speak.
So since Paul is a debtor to preach, what is this message he is so eager to bring to the center of the civilized world? Let's look at verse 16. He says he is not ashamed of the gospel of Christ.
Which is a huge statement in that culture.
Right. The commentary notes a sharp, almost dangerous contrast here. The gospel, which centers on a crucified carpenter from a backwater province, looks like absolute foolishness to carnal Roman eyes.
Yeah, Rome respects power. They respect military might, the eagle conquering armies.
And Paul is bringing them an instrument of state execution. Yet he is bringing it to the most splendid, powerful city on earth without flinching.
He doesn't shrink back because he understands the true nature of the message. The text calls the gospel the efficacy of God unto salvation.
Efficacy of God.
Yeah. Poole unpacks this by defining the gospel as an organical force.
Organical force.
Yeah.
Let's define that for the listener because that is not a phrase we use every day.
It means the gospel is an ordained means to an end. Poole compares it to a medicine.
Okay, medicine.
Right. A medicine might have the chemical capability to cure a deadly disease, but it's completely useless if it just sits in the bottle on the shelf.
Oh, obviously. You have to actually take it.
Exactly. It is only effective for those who actually receive it and apply it. The gospel is offered to all, but it brings salvation only to those who apply it through faith.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. In verse 17, Paul talks about the righteousness of God. Now, we have to pause here. When I hear the righteousness of God, my instinct is to think of God's own personal moral perfection. His internal attribute of being holy. How does Poole define this specific phrase in this context?
This raises what is arguably the most critical theological concept in the entire letter. The righteousness of God here does not refer to human righteousness.
So it's not our goodness?
No, it is not something we generate by trying really hard to be good people or by following a moral checklist. According to Poole, this righteousness is performed by the God-man, Jesus Christ. It is accepted by God the Father because it is absolutely flawless.
Okay.
And here is the mechanism. It is imputed to the believer.
Imputed, meaning credited to our account. Like a legal or financial transaction where someone else's perfect record is suddenly placed over my bankrupt account.
Yes, that is a great way to put it. We receive his righteousness just as he took on our sins through imputation on the cross. It is an exchange.
A completely one-sided exchange in our favor.
Absolutely. It is the only righteousness God can look at and find no fault with. Poole stresses that the law of God discovers no such way of justifying a sinner. Human reason and ancient philosophy cannot teach it. You cannot logic your way into imputation. Only the gospel reveals it.
Yeah, and the text says this righteousness is revealed from faith to faith. That is a phrase that can definitely trip people up. It sounds circular. What does it actually mean?
Poole offers a few variations on this to give it a robust meaning. First, it could mean from the faith of the Old Testament to the faith of the New Testament, showing the historical continuity of how God justifies people.
Like a progression through history.
Right. Second, it could mean from a lesser faith to a greater faith, noting the natural growth and perfection of a believer over time as they mature.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or, third, and perhaps most simply, it means that justification is wholly absolved by faith from start to finish. It is not moving from faith to works or from faith to law-keeping, but strictly from faith to faith.
To back this up, Paul quotes the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk, "The just shall live by faith." But Poole points out a fascinating shadow here.
Oh yes, the historical context of Habakkuk.
Yeah, because if you read Habakkuk, he was originally talking about temporal preservation from the Babylonian captivity. The Babylonians were literally coming to destroy the city, and Habakkuk said the just would survive by faith. How does that localized historical event connect to eternal salvation in Romans?
This is a classic example of biblical typology. The physical Babylonian captivity figured or shadowed our spiritual bondage under sin and Satan.
Well, a physical picture of a spiritual reality.
Exactly. Habakkuk was saying that faith would preserve the Israelites through that specific temporal calamity. Paul takes that historical reality and elevates it to apply to our eternal deliverance.
Wow, so the stakes get infinitely higher.
They do. Just as faith preserved them from the physical swords of the Babylonians, faith in Christ frees us from eternal spiritual destruction. The temporal, physical rescue shadows the eternal spiritual rescue.
Now, you, listening to this right now, might be wondering why Paul is spending so much time establishing this complicated mechanism of imputed righteousness. Why is it so desperately needed?
It is a fair question.
Because, as the text is about to make abundantly clear, humanity has absolutely no righteousness of its own, not even a little bit. We're moving into the section regarding the imprisonment of truth. Verse 18 talks about the wrath of God being revealed from heaven.
And Poole is very careful to define this wrath. We often think of natural disasters or historical judgments as just random bad luck. Like, oh, that was unfortunate.
Right, just a product of a chaotic universe.
But plagues and judgments do not just spring out of the dust. They do not come by chance or originate strictly from second causes like weather patterns or political shifts. They proceed originally from God.
But Poole notes an interesting grammatical structure in the Greek here, doesn't he?
He does. Paul uses the abstract ungodliness and unrighteousness for the concrete.
Meaning God targets the sin itself. He is not just, throwing lightning bolts at people randomly. The wrath is highly specific to the rebellion.
Spot on. The wrath is directed at those who hold the truth in unrighteousness.
I really want to focus on that phrase, hold the truth. Because when I hold something, usually I am possessing it, like I am holding a cup. But Poole uses a striking, almost violent metaphor here. He compares human beings to tyrants.
He does. He says humans act like tyrants who oppress and imprison innocent people.
Imprison the truth.
Yes. Humanity takes the natural knowledge of God, the baseline truth left in the human conscience since the fall, the common principles of equity and charity, and we literally imprison it. We suppress it wickedly so that we can sin more securely.
So we lock the truth in a dungeon because the truth is highly inconvenient to our desires.
That is a phenomenal image. The truth is a hostage. We know what is right, but we put a gag on it and lock it in the basement so we do not have to listen to it while we go about our lives.
But wait, let me push back on this, because this is an argument you hear all the time. How can people be held accountable for suppressing the truth if they do not have the scriptures?
The classic objection.
Right. You might have someone living in a remote part of the ancient world saying, I never read the Bible, I never met a prophet, how could I possibly know any of this?
Poole anticipates that exact defense.
Mm.
He points to what he calls the Book of the Creatures.
The book of the creatures.
Yeah, which is written in capital letters across the entire universe.
Oh.
Even without a single page of written law, the invisible attributes of God, his eternity, his Godhead, his almighty potency, are clearly seen in the visible creation.
So by looking at what is made, anyone with a functioning brain can argue from the effects to the cause. You see a painting, you know there is a painter.
Exactly. God gave all people such undeniable means of knowledge that it suffices to leave them without excuse.
Without excuse, that is a heavy verdict.
It is. There is no valid pretense of ignorance. The evidence of a creator is so overwhelming in the physical structure of the world that to deny it requires an active, willful, exhausting suppression of basic reason. You have to work really hard to ignore it.
So what does this all mean? If the truth is so glaringly obvious in the stars and the seasons, how did humanity get it so incredibly wrong?
We have to look at the folly of the philosophers and the anatomy of idolatry.
Right. Verse 21 says, they became vain in their imaginations. They knew God, but they failed to glorify him or be thankful. Instead, they attributed reality to chance or fortune or the influence of the stars.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see the tragic irony of human intellect. Poole points directly at the ancient philosophers.
The smartest guys in the room.
Exactly. These were men who were secularly brilliant. They understood advanced mathematics, astronomy, rhetoric, architecture, yet they became absolute fools in spiritual matters.
They understood the mechanics of the creature perfectly, but they erred entirely concerning the creator.
Yes. The commentary provides a highly specific historical detail here about Socrates that really brings this home.
Socrates, considered one of the wisest men of the ancient world, a core pillar of Western thought.
Right. But Poole notes that with his dying breath, after drinking the hemlock, Socrates asked his friends to offer a rooster to the false god Aesculapius.
Wow, so even at the very end.
It perfectly demonstrates Paul's point. Even the absolute pinnacle of human wisdom, when disconnected from divine revelation, ends in rank superstitious idolatry. They set up puppets and idols of their own devising in the room of the true God.
They changed the glory of the incorruptible God into images made like corruptible man, birds, beasts, and creeping things.
Which is just absurd when you think about it rationally.
But surely these ancient people knew a block of wood wasn't actually the creator of the universe, right? I mean, a Roman senator wasn't that naive. They knew a statue was just marble.
Poole addresses this sophisticated defense using a historical parallel. He brings up Symmachus.
Symmachus.
Yeah, a brilliant Roman orator and politician who begged the emperors Valentinian and Theodosius to restore the old Roman gods to the Senate.
Okay, and what was his argument?
Symmachus argued a very nuanced point. He claimed the Romans didn't actually worship the statues themselves. They weren't stupid. They worshiped the true God through the statues.
Ah.
They saw the images simply as conduits or representations to help focus their minds on the divine.
That sounds incredibly modern. It is the exact excuse people use today when they engage in syncretism. It's just a symbol to help me connect.
It is a very slick argument, but Poole strictly refutes this logic. He asserts that worship intended for God via an image is simply the worship of the image itself.
You can't separate the two.
No. The Israelites tried the exact same thing in the desert with the golden calf. They explicitly claimed the calf represented the God who brought them out of Egypt. They were trying to worship Yahweh through the gold.
And God condemned it as pure idolatry.
Absolutely. Poole equates this ancient pagan defense with modern practices regarding images, offering a severe warning about the mechanics of idolatry. You cannot rebrand the infinite God into a physical object of your own making without fundamentally changing the truth into a lie. The medium corrupts the message.
And this suppression of truth, this creation of sophisticated idols to replace the creator, inevitably triggers a terrifying divine response. We are entering the darkest part of the chapter here, the judicial handover.
This part is very sobering.
It is. 3 times in this passage, Paul uses a chilling phrase, God gave them up. Now, what does that actually mean? Does God just passively step back? Does he just, take his hands off the steering wheel, sigh, and let people do what they want?
Poole strongly clarifies that this is not mere permission.
Okay.
It is not just a passive withdrawal of grace where God looks away. It is a judicial, active handing over. God, acting as a perfectly just judge, puts rebellious humanity directly into the hands of Satan and their own corrupted lusts. He sentences them to their own desires.
That is a staggering, horrifying concept.
Yeah.
God actively uses sin as a punishment for sin.
It is terrifying. The commentary points to Psalm 81 to illustrate this concept. God punishes previous iniquity by allowing further iniquity. When humanity actively abandons the author of nature, the just, terrifying response is to allow them to abandon the very order of nature itself.
The rebellion gains momentum until it crushes the rebel.
Precisely. Which leads right into verses 26 and 27, where Paul details the unnatural uncleanness of the ancient Roman world. Because they changed the glory of God into the similitude of beasts, they were left to do things that even beasts abhorred. It is a complete systemic inversion of the natural design.
And it does not happen all at once, does it?
No. Poole traces the specific downward steps of this judicial handover. It is a staircase into the dark. First, they are given up to their own heart's lusts. The internal desires go unchecked.
Right.
Then they are given over to vile, dishonorable affections. The internal desires become external, shameful actions. And finally, the absolute rock bottom. They are given over to a reprobate mind.
A reprobate mind. Let's unpack that term. Because we use reprobate casually sometimes, like, oh, he's a reprobate. But what does it mean in this theological context?
It means an injudicious mind, a mind completely void of judgment. It is a mind that has lost the ability to distinguish between right and wrong.
So the compass is just gone.
Completely. It is an evil habit of thought so deeply ingrained, so calcified, that the person can do nothing but evil. Because they did not see fit to retain God in their knowledge, God saw fit to leave them with a corrupt judgment, or really no moral judgment at all. It is the total catastrophic collapse of the internal moral compass. They look at a lie and genuinely believe it is the truth.
Once that compass is smashed, once the mind is fully reprobate, what does that society look like on the ground? Verse 29 unleashes a massive, exhausting list of sins against the second table of the law. The law is concerning how we treat each other.
Poole notes that unrighteousness is the genus, the fountain from which all these specific streams of wickedness flow.
Fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, envy, murder, deceit. It is a portrait of a society tearing itself apart from the inside because the anchor of truth is gone.
Yes, and one specific category in this massive list really stands out.
Inventors of evil things.
Yes. Think about the psychology behind that. People weren't satisfied with the old, traditional, run-of-the-mill sins. They actually had to invent new ones.
They got bored with standard cruelty.
They did. The commentary shares some brutal historical examples of this. Phalaris, the ancient tyrant, who literally offered a financial reward to anyone who could invent a new method of torture for him.
That is how we got the brazen bull, right?
Yes. And Sardanapalus, who offered royal rewards for anyone who could find out new, unheard-of venereal pleasures. It shows the boundless creative depravity of a reprobate mind.
They are innovating in the space of cruelty and lust. They apply human genius to destruction.
And this innovation leads to the breakdown of the most basic human instincts. Poole points out the phrase, without natural affection, citing the horrifying pagan practice of sacrificing their own children to idols.
Which goes against every biological instinct we have.
Exactly. When you lose the creator, you lose the fundamental fabric of human empathy. The parents who are supposed to protect the child become the executioners, and they do it thinking it is religious duty.
So, what does this all mean for us today? As we look at verse 32, the final verse of the chapter, we see the absolute floor of human morality. The text explains that knowing the judgment of God, knowing inherently that these things are wrong and worthy of death, people not only do them, but they have pleasure in them that do them.
Poole explicitly states that this is the highest possible degree of wickedness. Patronizing, applauding, and taking pleasure in the sins of others is the worst state of all.
Why is that worse than actually committing the sin yourself?
Because it comes closest to the nature of the devil himself, who loves evil simply because it is evil. When you commit a sin yourself, you might be driven by a momentary flash of passion or fear or weakness, but when you sit back and applaud the sin of another person, you are showing a cold, calculated alignment with wickedness. You are celebrating the rebellion without even the excuse of personal temptation.
You, listening to this right now, think about how this commentary utterly dismantles any notion of human self-sufficiency. If humans are left entirely to themselves, without divine intervention, we do not ascend to some enlightened technological utopia. We descend.
We descend rapidly.
We descend into a reprobate mind, turning the truth into a lie and innovating our own destruction. This terrifying empirical reality is precisely why the imputed righteousness we discussed back in verse 17 is the only viable rescue. We cannot fix the structural collapse of the soul with our own broken tools.
This raises an interesting question. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If this entire descent into complete moral collapse begins simply with the failure to be thankful to God, as we saw back in verse 21, how might our daily ingratitude be a subtle echo of the very rebellion that fractured the ancient world?
That is a sobering thought.
Think about how recognizing God as the source of all good is not just polite religious behavior, it is the vital psychological anchor that keeps the human mind from fracturing.
Because once you lose sight of the foundation, the whole building comes down. The diagnostic scanner might be murky, but the cure is crystal clear. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Reformed thinking.